Hello and welcome back to the Packaging Europe podcast. I'm your host, Victoria Hattersley, and today I'm speaking to some guests all the way over in Australia. So we're recording this at a strange time for all of us, just to explain why we sound less sharp than perhaps I'd like to. Our two guests today are Chris Foley, who is CEO of the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, or APCO, and Renata Daudt, who is a sustainable packaging consultant with AWEN Packaging Consulting. Have I pronounced that right, Renata?
That's right.
Yeah. Who specialise in guiding brand owners on the APCO Sustainable Packaging Guidelines. So today we're going to be talking about Australia's packaging regulations, particularly what is upcoming and the role APCO plays within this, and also what kind of the rest of the world can learn from what's going on here. So I know many of our listeners will be familiar with the work of APCO, but just for those who aren't, perhaps we could kick off with a bit of background behind the organisation and how it's contributed so far to the evolution of Australia's packaging regulation. Chris, maybe as CEO of APCO, then you'd be the best person to start here.
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity, Victoria. So the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, otherwise known as APCO, is a co-regulator of the Australian packaging system. So what that means in practical terms is that we have close to 2,500 of Australia's largest organisations that place packaging on market. And we work within a piece of national legislation called the National Environmental Protection Measure, that then requires us to liaise or work with the 9 state, territory and federal environment ministers, and hence the term co-regulatory. So we work between industry and government to collaborate, to co-develop, to administer, essentially represent industry's interest, but equally represent those of our federated government system. What that means is helping industry essentially help itself, self-regulate in some areas, development of packaging standard, development of packaging guidelines, development and acquittal of a packaging labelling program that's certainly all pervasive on Australian supermarket and grocery and general merchandise shelves, along with data governance, compliance reporting, and member support and services. So in a nutshell, that's what we do. And it's a fairly unique role. But the program is circa 25 years old. It's voluntary, which is probably another key point of difference. Members can choose to acquit their obligations under federal law. They can choose to acquit those obligations through us, or they need to navigate their way around state and territory environmental protection agencies. We would argue that it's much more efficient to acquit through us. They pay a membership fee for that privilege, and then we work on their behalf and help them through the journey.
So you're really kind of acting as a kind of a complement to federal legislation.
Correct. But equally, we need to navigate state and territory legislation. And that's all the more reason for regulatory reform and review, which is underway at the moment at a national level, because it is quite a complex web of. We have 3 levels of government in Australia: local, state, territory, and federal. If you're a national brand owner, like most of our members are, it can be quite challenging to have a consistent packaging format across all states and territories. So we're certainly working on behalf of our members to advocate, work with government to simplify that for industry, to in turn drive better outcomes for the environment.
And so we know that Australia is planning a complete overhaul of its packaging regulation, and this has been in the pipeline, I understand, for quite a few months now. Could you maybe, I know it's very complex, but could you maybe give me sort of a very brief outline of the main
Sure.
kind of points
So
of this?
yeah, look, and we've been really open with. So I started as CEO of APCO sort of 2.5, 3 years ago,
Mm.
and soon after starting, we did a review of the national packaging targets, and this review identified a number of really that for all the work and all the effort that a number of brand owners had invested, the targets are still a long way off, sort of, from most of them. And the challenge there is that for all the improvement that was being done through the good work of consultants and service providers like Renata, there are gaps in the downstream systems. So you could have the most technically recyclable packaging, but if that's not going into a system that supports its recovery, sorting, and reprocessing, it's not going to work. So we know that we also know that the whole concept of free riders, and not all businesses, although responsible businesses are doing their bit and many are doing a lot, not everybody's doing the same, lifting at the same level. We know that when we have issues with some of our own members and or free riders, it's awfully complicated to have them prosecuted because of the way we have a federation of 3 levels of government, and the states and territories are under-resourced. So the federal government, to their credit, have really been looking at, over the last few years, a review of packaging regulation, and working with the state and territory environment ministers. In late last year, they took 3 regulatory reform options to industry and the community. One of those was essentially strengthening the current co-regulatory arrangement, which we know and we are calling out is not effective anymore. And when it was set up 25 years ago, the concept of plastic, the plastic crisis, didn't exist. The term circular economy didn't exist. So
No, we forget they're
it's
relatively recent additions.
correct. They are. Who would have thought that circular economy is something new, and who would have thought that we would be talking about a plastic crisis back in 25 years ago? So one of the options was, hey, strengthen the current arrangements. But as I said, we're not advocating for that. The next option that was tested was national mandatory requirements for packaging, and that's where the onus would actually be on business. That they'd be very blunt bans on problematic materials and chemicals. There'd be enforcement. They'd enforce progressive bans to ensure minimum recyclability performance. That set minimum recycled content thresholds, and they'd mandate clear and consistent recyclability labelling. But it would be a case of do it yourself and report, but the onus is on you. And so compared to the current arrangements where you've got a co-regulator there to back industry in, there was a big emphasis on do it yourself. If you want to self-police, that's fine. The third option, so that may be fine if you were a large national organisation with a lot of infrastructure and resource and capacity. But for most businesses, packaging's not their core game. They make and sell food product, groceries, general merchandise, whatever it is. They don't want to get caught up in all the other peripherals of making packaging sustainable. The third option that was then taken through the consultation was extended producer responsibility and establishing an EPR scheme at a national level. And that's where there would be, while at the moment, states and territories set their own legislation in this area. The state and territory ministers have agreed, which is amazing, to pass that responsibility to the federal government. The task that the federal government are now doing is looking at, one of their concepts is EPR. So that would be establishing a national EPR scheme with an administrative body overseeing industry level outcomes. You could argue not dissimilar to the role that APCO currently plays. There would, if this model, if this option was successful, it would obviously, there would be some protocol process that we would be obviously very keen to apply, but there would be some transparency around how that decision was made. There would be the application of eco-modulated fees to incentivise recyclable design and replacing progressive bans, which we see as a very progressive move. And we're certainly strong advocates of that. Brand owners need to start thinking about EPR, the concept of EPR fees or eco-modulated fees, where you are incentivised by doing the right thing, but you are actually going to pay more to offset the true cost of the environmental impact that you have through your packaging in the downstream system. Because without those gaps being paid for by the producer, they're never going to be fixed properly. And if it's a mandated scheme, everybody's in scope, then it's certainly much more equitable and the costs can be shared. And it's done through Australia at a national level, then the ability to coordinate and drive economically efficient outcomes as well as environmentally efficient outcomes is much, much easier for the greater good of the system. The whole idea here is that the fees will be based on packaging placed on market, and the system, there'll be a support system that would be in play to motivate sustainable packaging design. So, but those were the three options. So you had the EPR, you had a mandatory requirement approach, and you had strengthening the current arrangements. But they've received feedback. They've recently published the feedback. I think somewhere between 65 and 70% of respondents want the third option of EPR.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a splattering across the rest. And,
yeah, that chimes in with kind of what we're hearing in Europe as well, where EPR is very much at the top of the conversation.
Yes, correct. And it's now the challenge here, or the art, is how it's designed and how it's implemented. And we're obviously keen on behalf. So our membership represents close to 80% of packaging placed on market. And on behalf of our members, we're certainly keen to support and see that option 3 for EPR get up. And because of the role of collective action, equity through eco-modulation, mandated participation, national design standards, these are all great things to drive system change to inevitably deliver circular outcomes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Chris. That gives us a really, really good overview of the situation right now. Renata, I was wondering if you could now sort of jump in with the point of view from your consultancy and how you view the significance of all this.
Oh, well, it's really exciting because it will make everybody to take action, right? We'll see a lot of companies engaging and work on their packaging, but as Chris said, there's still a lot that not doing much. And I think having a national EPR will be really beneficial because we'll see really results, and also everybody will be working together. So really to have available, materials to be recyclable, to have access to recycled content is the way to go. And this coming from Europe, PPWR, we see a lot. We learn a lot from what's happening in Europe, even though the PPWR just got enforced this year. It's been around for a couple of years. And I guess we can compare a little bit because Europe, there are a lot of countries, and in Australia it's a huge country, but it's separate by states and territories that they have different laws and regulations. So it's a bit similar, in a way. So
similar kind of challenges.
The challenge is similar to try to harmonize, our legislation or regulation, a standard packaging standard across the region.
So, how would you say, you obviously already have quite a good understanding of the planned overhaul of Australia's regulations. How would you say some of the suggested plans kind of chime in with what we're seeing in Europe? And conversely, do you think there's anything that Europe can learn from what's being proposed in Australia?
I guess we are, so I know Australia, they are the government and APCO looking into what Belgium is doing with the eco-modulation fee, the Netherlands. So we are learning from Europe first, right, to implement this eco-modulation fees and, getting everybody on board. But the other thing which we are working is the harmonization across the country. And this is not only for packaging standards, but also for waste collection, the bins. And I know there's a discussion between the yellow bag and the blue bag in Germany and Belgium. I guess if we get to the harmonization in Australia first, Europe can learn from us how to deal with different parties and that.
Thank you, Renata.
I think one comment I'd just make there is that, to Renata's point, we've certainly been looking at and having deep conversations with a lot of schemes across Europe, and it's been really fantastic just the knowledge sharing both ways. What's worked, what hasn't worked. One comment I would make is that all jurisdictions are slightly different. So in an Australian context, we have a quite advanced curbside system. So, and that's been a long-standing program across most of the country, which sees literally at the front of most people will be able to put their recycling bin out for collection. So that's a long-standing piece of infrastructure, whereas in Belgium and other jurisdictions, the EPR fees and arrangements, when they were set up, were having to essentially start from scratch. So the cost, I'm hoping that the cost recovery is really about the additionality. And that's certainly top of mind for us. It's really a case of what else can we either get into the curbside bin, and if it's not appropriate to get materials collected through the curbside bin, what's the most appropriate channel for recovery? But above all, those materials, they need an end market. So where do they go? Who's going to process them? Who's going to do the offtake? Which is why design standards and mandates on both design, but also mandates on minimum recycled content really come into play, both for packaging content, but also just the whole mindset and the shift around circular outcomes that how can businesses embrace and take on recyclate into their business models beyond just packaging to packaging.
And what about, we've talked a lot about recycling and recycled content, recycle it, but about reuse, for example, what's the situation there in Australia? Are there plans to kind of regulate that more tightly? I mean, I know in Europe, for example, there's been a lot of difficulty in really scaling it up, and there are lots of consortia now that are sort of working on that. I wonder if that's the case in Australia. Sorry, Renata, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, the thing is, Australia is a huge country, and most of the population is around the coast. So there is this distance, between centers. So, like, let's say Sydney, it's very industrial, and Melbourne, and then you go to Western Australia, which is like 1,000 kilometers away, it's quite long. So it's how to master the supply chain, the collection for the reuse. There is a progress, but it's also a challenge that I see that it happens here. That's the farmers, from each side.
Okay, thank you.
I think building on that, certainly from APCO's perspective, there's a lot that can be done possibly or probably more efficiently in the first instance with reuse in supply chains, and also in public place settings. Like my background was, I was 9.5 years in big box retail, so headed up sustainability, particularly with an environmental focus for Kmart and Target businesses, and we were able to drive incredible outcomes for reuse within our own supply chain systems that delivered incredible environmental outcomes, but also incredible economic outcomes within our closed loop systems that we could create. And that mindset and experience, I think, is something that I'm keen to make sure that other businesses can look at and consider versus the whole lot of bring a bottle back into a store, where that's ultimately where we want to get to, whether it be detergent, and we know, or whatever the consumable is. And we know that that's the ultimate outcome, but that's going to be a really long journey, and that takes many systems to be changed. But there's also then big opportunities around public place. And again, I think we need to take, in an Australian context, to Renata's comment around just the logistics of our country versus the density of a lot of the European countries. It is a bit more complicated, so it's going to take a bit longer, and particularly just given the economies of scale. So we have to be really careful with where we lean into reuse systems and go for the path of least resistance, where it does make economic sense in the first instance.
Okay, thank you. And I'm also interested, I think, in talking about how there are some areas in which we really need more global harmonization. We talk a lot about kind of regional differences in terms of regulations. But I was wondering, for example, the work on the Global Plastics Treaty, how important you think that's going to be?
Yeah, paramount.
Yeah.
So we're a signatory. You would argue that we're part of the High Ambition Coalition, as is the Australian government. And we're at the end of the world's supply chain. We're a small little island. And we like to think that we're a big island. We are geographically a big island. But in reality, we're a small market in an amazingly idyllic environment at the bottom of the world. So it's really important that we can achieve global standardization or harmonization around polymers in particular.
Yeah.
And it just makes sense. It's when relative to our Pacific Island neighbours, we're the big fish in a small pond. But relative to the rest of the world, we take what is made. Again, having come from the likes of Kmart Group and Target and APCO, we were sourcing Asia, and 85% of what we sold in the Australian market, in the New Zealand market, or across Asia was sourced from Asia. They in turn were sourcing their raw materials often, and they produced some domestically, but often it was coming out of European markets. So particularly with polymers, there's a long global supply chain. That's got to be better managed and harmonised. I'll be interested to see what Renata actually has to say about that from her perspective with her clients.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to go on to Renata. Is there anything you'd like to add there? 'Cause obviously you must have this discussion a lot with your clients.
Yes, yeah, most of them in different markets. So I believe that if we could at least agree in some materials, polymers, like would be a great start. But another thing would be labeling, or like how could we make a global label, like to really not or help our customers to understand what to do after use. This, I think, would be one of the priorities in globally saying. It's like having the communication seamless to between markets.
Yeah, that's a really important point, I think. Is there anything else you can think of that is really kind of the top priority in terms of achieving global standardization, harmonization?
I guess sharing data, or first of all collecting them, and then we can learn from each other. I know that data privacy is also very complex topic, but perhaps a platform or something that we could really share that and learn from each other, so we also have a better understanding and evidence to choose, to use the correct material, and know we have to find a way to use them, in a global way.
Yeah, and that's another, I mean, we could have another whole podcast about that, but that's another very interesting conversation, how you can achieve that balance between brand protection, data protection, but also sharing what's necessary. There are I think a few platforms now that are in development that are showing promise, but I suppose that's something that yeah, we probably don't have time to discuss today, but it's definitely another interesting conversation. Um, so I also wanted to quickly ask Chris, going back on something you said earlier, there's areas in Europe where perhaps regulation hasn't been as successful. I wondered what those were, and what Australia has sort of taken from that and learned from that when it's building on its own regulatory structure.
I think, and it's not for me to criticize what any jurisdiction has done, because again, as I made the comment earlier on, every jurisdiction has a slightly different context and need.
Yeah, of course.
I think what is increasingly evident is that whether it's here or afar, the power of a mandate responsibility framework is more effective than a voluntary approach. And we researched this with our membership throughout last year around, okay, if our research into our national packaging targets has identified systemic challenges and gaps that need to be fixed, and those gaps are largely economic, and that's a pretty common theme around the world. If material's not worth collecting to be recycled, then why would somebody invest in collecting? So if we need to and if the infrastructure is not there because it's not worth, there's no business case, why would somebody invest? So if we're trying to solve for those economic challenges, putting the hat around or trying to collect voluntarily will only get you so far. And the challenge then is, how do you establish and use eco-modulated fees or EPR fees that incentivize design, sustainable design, incentivize minimization, incentivize reuse, incentivize recycled content, and then collect those fees to then be reinvested intelligently across the system to address the gaps. That we know what that, and now that's the North Star, certainly in an Australian context. From APCO's perspective, we're doing everything we can within our remit as a co-regulator to support government and the environment ministers to help them make the best decision with their regulatory reform program to benefit industry, but also to benefit the community and the environment. We're going to get one opportunity to do this. The current program's been in place for 25 years. It's been, when I say it's been great, it's been interesting watching some of the goings on and trials and tribulations of what's happening in, say, the UK.
Yeah.
And just the challenges that you have when you try to reset and reallocate fee collection and cost allocation. So again, we've had the benefit of being able to watch from down under what's happening in Europe and speak to some of the key decision makers and have them take us aside and say, "Oh, whatever you do, don't try what we just did.
Don't do that.
Whatever you do, don't do that. And/or whatever you do, start slowly. Don't try to do everything at once. It's going to rely heavily on really good data. That's not going to happen overnight. So sometimes for us to go fast, we need to go slow. And I think that's been a real learning. But the other piece is the need for a really well thought out and well protected legislation to support it nationally from an Australian point of view, given that we've got a federation of states. It's really important. And it's really, it pains me to say this, but hopefully if government taking a little bit longer to do it than we would all like, if that gets us to the right place in a couple of years' time, it will be worth it. Because
Okay.
we need a really strong. So you go, Renata.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. You need a strong, law that everybody will be hard at the beginning. Is what I'm gonna say. It will be hard, but will be what will make the wheel, start. It will really start establishing a real circular economy. Otherwise, I don't think we can really move forward with what we have now. Like when it's not mandatory, it's not a priority.
I think
No.
Sorry. One thing that we're doing at the moment is APCO, we've developed a 2030 strategic plan, and that's really about helping transition industry to this future state of regulation. And again, we were all hoping that it was going to be done last year, that it was all going to be tick, away you go. But
I see.
everybody underestimated, whether it's through our government or through our industry, this is really complicated. And again, that's where having a lot of dialogue with European colleagues, they just highlighted it's going to be hard. And it's going to be really confronting because there's so much commercial gain and or loss. And so, yeah, the small steps up and really strong regulatory framework is necessary. But again, our members wanted it. 85% of them said we want strong, robust EPR program. So in an Australian frame, industry would prefer to be just told, you're all in, this is what it looks like. Because most businesses that I've come across, business wants to do the right thing, but they just want clarity, certainty and equity.
Yeah, and of course, and that makes absolute sense. And as you say, the voluntary commitments have been very important. For example, the Ellen MacArthur global commitment, but they've really driven the conversation forward. But we are now all at a point where we need regulation things. So I think, Chris, you said that maybe in the next couple of years we can expect to see this regulation being put in place. So I guess we're going to be kind of watching the space quite closely.
Oh, look, I think one of the challenges with regulatory uncertainty in an Australian context is that in the next 4 months there will be a federal election.
Mm.
And so the last 4 years of activity in this space may well be challenged if there was a change of government and or even a change of environment minister. And with elections, anything's possible. So that's something that's very real. We're hoping that, and I'm pretty confident, or I am confident, that this issue of packaging reform is seen to be bipartisan and in the nation's best interest. States and territories certainly want a better way of working, and so too, from what we can tell, the two major political parties and most of the independents. So there is certainly a general sense of progress will be made. It's just there'll be a slight delay to let democracy happen through an election. A possibly new minister come in if the existing minister stands nationally and return, then it may well be quicker. I think there may be, but again, it's the federal government's program. But with an election happening, it may not be till later in the year before a clear decision is made. And if the decision is that they need new legislation, it may well take a couple of years for new legislation to be crafted and approved through Parliament. And then you would have a year or two of establishment. So suddenly, material change could actually be probably best case 2-3 years, realistically probably 4, maybe 5 years away.
Yeah.
So all the more reason for APCO's 2030 strategy as a transition for industry to give investment certainty and to set a North Star to align industry to support government through these uncertain times. But the show goes on. Businesses need to use packaging, but that packaging needs to be more sustainable, and the system needs to be strengthened and invested in. And that's where, certainly from APCO's point of view, the time is now for our 2030 strategy.
Fantastic, thank you. Before we wrap up, Renata, is there anything else that you wanted to leave our listeners with?
Well, I want to say that if the regulation can come in 2 or 5 years, but I strongly believe that will come. And so don't wait the last minute to start thinking about that. So really work through packaging and review your packaging without leaving for the last minute when you have to pay, certain fees that you don't want to.
Yeah,
and I think
start now.
It's a bit like the European experience from all the jurisdictions that we've spoken to. The sooner that businesses start working either internally or with consultants like Renata on strengthening their data, improving their knowledge of their packaging footprint and their materials and their design optimization, they've got to do themselves a favour, whether they're an Australian-based company or somebody in the EU or England. The cost of trying to catch up is often greater than the cost of leaning in at the front end.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a really good takeaway to leave our listeners with. Start now. Otherwise, it's going to cost you very much more in the long term. So all that remains for me to say is thank you to my 2 guests. I would also like to say, as always, a big thank you to our listeners. And just to let you know, following on from this podcast, there will be a long report on the exclusive membership section of our website in the coming weeks, which will be looking at packaging regulations from a more global perspective, but encompassing many of the topics we've talked about today. So do keep an eye out for that. Thank you and enjoy your days.